Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're waiting for a few more people to join. We'll get started, like I said, just another minute. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the 16th Annual Orthodox Network Forum. Our topic for today is awareness and education, substance and behavioral addictions, and the Orthodox Jewish communities. My name is Tamara Kushnir Groman, and I'm the manager of benefit services and the legal help desk at CJE SeniorLife. I am also a member of the Orthodox Network. Please note that today's program is being recorded and will be shared after the forum. For those of you interested in getting CEUs today, please listen for the special code word that will be required on the CEU form. We would like every participant, regardless of whether you're getting CEUs, to fill out an evaluation. Please look for the link in the chat toward the end of the program. Please keep in mind CEUs may take a few weeks to be finalized, so please be patient with us. We are so pleased to have participants from across the United States and Canada with us today. The Orthodox Network is a collaboration of social service providers in Jewish agencies who work in partnership to improve services to the Orthodox communities in metropolitan Chicago. The partner agencies co-sponsoring this forum are all listed on the flyer for today. A special thank you goes out to the members of the Orthodox Network Forum Planning Committee. Eddie Lowe, Jeffrey Blumenfeld, Nicole Druckman, and Rabbi David Rosenberg from JCFS Chicago, Samantha Spolter with JCFS Chicago and soon to be moving to ARC Chicago, Esther Yona Friedman from Shalva, Rabbi Shlomo Crandall from Chai Lifeline, Dr. Malcolm Miller from Nefesh Chicago. It is a pleasure and honor to work with each of you. Thank you also to the team at JCFS who work to ensure CEUs are available. Substance and behavioral addiction have been in the news a lot lately. These addictions challenge all kinds of individuals, families, and communities. The more we learn, the more progress we can make together towards supporting all those who need us. This morning, we will identify dynamics of substance and behavioral addictions, substance use disorders, and non-substance related disorders, and how they impact Orthodox Jewish individuals, families, and institutions. We will consider cultural barriers within Orthodox Jewish communities to seeking help in cases of substance and behavioral addictions. We will also discuss ways to help Orthodox Jewish individuals to cope with the impacts of the full spectrum of addiction. I am so grateful to all of you, social service professionals and communal leaders who address these problems in the course of your work. Every community faces its own challenges with addiction. It is thanks to the dedicated work of agencies, professionals, and rabbis that we are able to address this topic in a meaningful way today. Following their presentations, our panelists welcome questions. Please submit your questions through the chat box, and our moderator, Rabbi David Rosenberg, Orthodox Community Liaison from JCFS Chicago, will bring them to the panelists. It is now my pleasure to welcome Samantha Spolter, who will introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Tamara. Good morning, everyone. We have 4 excellent speakers this morning for you, and their bios are quite extensive. So bear with me as I introduce our 4 panelists for this morning. We have DJ Shabat, is a certified alcohol and other drug counselor who has been working with people struggling with substance use disorders for a number of years, covering multiple modalities. For the past 6+ years, DJ has been a community advocate and partner for change in the Orthodox Jewish community. Dr. Beth Fishman, my coworker at JCFS, has worked with individuals and families impacted by a wide range of substance use disorders and other addictive behaviors for over 25 years. Dr. Fishman is the program manager of addiction services at JCFS Chicago. In this capacity, she offers education and support to Chicagoland Jews in recovery and their allies, and helps the Jewish community create safe, welcoming, sacred space for individuals at risk and in recovery. She has championed and published on the need for Jewish organizations to open their buildings to 12-step and other recovery meetings. Supporting and healing of adults raised in families with parental addiction is one of her special areas of specialty. Dr. Fishman is licensed as a clinical psychologist by the state of Illinois. We next welcome Yankie Greenberger. Mr. Greenberger is a trauma and addiction therapist, as well as one of the premier adolescent therapists in the Jewish community. For 13 years, Mr. Greenberger served as the clinical director of 2 community organizations, which have collectively supported well over 1,000 individuals and families. He is the founder of the Illinois Healing Center and is a certified sex addiction therapist through the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Last but certainly not least, we have Rabbi Engel, who is the rabbi of Congregation or Torah in Skokie, just down the street from me. In addition to his pastoral, educational, and organizational responsibilities, Rabbi Engel currently serves as the recording secretary of the RCA. He is a former president of the CRC and former chair of the membership committee of the Rabbinical Council of America. His affiliations include AIPAC and the Jewish United Fund of Greater Metropolitan Chicago. Before arriving in Skokie, Rabbi Engel served as a rabbi in Fairfield, Connecticut. Born and raised in Montreal, Rabbi Engel studied at Yeshivat Etzion, holds a BA in English Literature from YU, and received his rabbinical ordination from REITs, an affiliate of Yeshiva University, in 2002. Beyond enjoying the benefits of strong mentors with his own family and of various teachers, Rabbi Engel credits a number of formative experiences with shaping his approach to the rabbinate, including working with Jewish youth in Australia, Belarus, Canada, Israel, Poland, Ukraine, and the United States. So without further ado, we will start with DJ Shabat.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, taking time out of your day for this issue that's very important to me. When I was growing up, I remember the picture that I had in my head of people that suffered from substance use disorder. I remember thinking of, like, you know, the homeless guy with the brown bag, the brown paper bag that was holding his bottle of alcohol, or the guy that, you know, maybe was begging for money on the streets, and thinking about how he was going to be the person that was probably just using, you know, whatever money to go buy a substance. And I think that's a very dangerous image that we put in our head when we think of, you know, addicts and alcoholics. And one of the things that I'm proud to say for the last 6 years is that my name is DJ and I'm an alcoholic. And I think the point of why I like to share my story is for us to understand that alcoholics and addicts look just like the rest of us, right? When I was, right before I went to treatment, I was the CEO of a company. I was running, you know, the company. Things seemed very good. But as with everything in this world that we currently live in, we never really know what's going on with someone behind closed doors. So getting back to me and how I got here. So I grew up in the from Orthodox Jewish community. My father was a black hat aguda, basically. I went to Yeshiva Tzvi. After that, I went to Skokie Yeshiva for all of high school, then to Israel, and then back to Skokie Yeshiva for until I got kicked out. But that's a different story. That's something else we're talking about on a different forum. But anyways, there's nothing in my life that I wanted or needed for. We're upper middle class family. Nothing in my life that I would consider to be a traumatic event. My parents were married and happy-ish for the entire duration, and they continue to still be together and be happy. And so I think that one of the other stories that we kind of tell ourselves is that addicts and alcoholics, people that suffer from these substance use disorders, must come from a broken home. It must be from trauma. It must be from this. And while a lot of that can be true, and a lot of that can can lead to substance use disorder, right? It's not the only way. So back to me. I remember I had my first drink when I was about 8 days old. Someone just hurt me and they put some wine in my mouth. And like thinking about it in retrospect, like even back then I was already using, substances to cope with pain, right? Um, um, what I really remember my first drink being is I remember sometime between the age of probably 8 to 10. And my father, he wasn't a big drinker. He wasn't, the one going to Kiddush Club and Shul. I've never seen my father drunk ever in my life. Never seen him take more than like a shot or two or whatever. He had a really good relationship with alcohol, keeping it only on, for simcha, keeping it only for ritual and all those kinds of things. But I remember occasionally, on Shabbos afternoon, he would have a little bit of banana schnapps in ice. And I remember that when I was, again, somewhere between 8 and 10, I thought it tasted very good. And so I would sneak into his room while he was taking a Shabbos nap and drink it up and finish whatever he didn't drink. And like, okay, that's an aside, that's just something to notate. It'll become probably more relevant later on. When I turned 13, there was this whole new world that was open to me, because suddenly I can go to Kiddush after davening, and I can have some shots, right? It wasn't like it wasn't exactly encouraged, but it wasn't discouraged, right? And like I found myself trying to make Kiddush, right, as many times as I could for as many people that I needed. And a lot of that for me was because when I was growing up and going into Tversvi and going into these different things, on a personal level, I never felt like I fit in. Right? I never felt like I was a part of something. I was always slightly different, right? I had these questions. So I was kind of like this fringe student that, was kind of pushed off to the side. I remember I used to get extra recess instead of, going to the principal's office, although I went to the principal's office a lot as well. And like when I finally started trying this substance, like I suddenly felt cool. And again, thinking back on it and thinking back on the people that I looked up to at the time, right? It wasn't my father who was going to shul every day and davening 3 times a day and learning. It was the people in shul that I considered cool, right? As part of the, reward system behavior model that we talk about on how our brain works, right? I saw cool, I wanted to be cool, and that's what those guys were drinking. So I would drink to be cool. And then I felt like I was part of something. And I remember thinking like I was very good at it. And like this was finally gonna be that thing that can help me to connect with people. And I remember like I was in 8th grade and I remember being at Kins actually. And I was in a competition with my friends and I'd be like, hey, Maishi, I've had 4 shots. How many shots have you had? And he'd be like 0. I'd be like, nerd. Hey, Neil, I've had 8 shots. How many shots have you had? And he'd be like, 0. So again, this was my perspective at the time. Clearly, I was the only one that was in this competition, right? No one else was really thinking about how much it was, how cool I was for how I was drinking. Another thing that I wanted to mention was the house. When the house I grew up in, we only had one TV. It was only my parents' room, so I didn't have those type of influences. The things that were influencing me were shul and the people around me. My rebbeim, my teachers, my friends, but generally like the people that I had in my nuclear radius, so to speak. Right, like these were the people that I saw every week. I saw the people that I thought were the cool guys, and I thought the people that I thought weren't the cool guys. So throughout high school, again, not encouraged, but not exactly discouraged, right? I could drink every Shabbos, and I did. I didn't intend to be, at my sister's house throwing up in the bathroom, but like if I just blamed it on a stomach bug, it was kind of like, okay, it's okay. Oh, he's just a kid. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. And then throughout high school, wherever there was parties, we were always making sure that there was alcohol. We're always making sure that we had what we needed. Purim was kind of its own monster, right? Like again, not necessarily encouraged, but certainly tolerated and not discouraged. And certainly I wasn't getting in trouble for any of the stuff that I was doing. Um, and a lot of that was because I was hiding it, but that's neither here nor there. When I turned 21, I was again, and even throughout Israel, like I was again in a situation where like I didn't have any parental supervision. I had all these new stimuluses, right? And it was accessible. I had access to any of the substances that I wanted. And being outside of my parental supervision, without the correct coping skills that I hadn't yet built, I would always turn to alcohol. And that's kind of something that we even see within the wider world. And that's the message that we're teaching our youth, right? Is that when you feel bad about something, when you feel like there's, if you feel nervous about giving a speech in front of a whole group of Zoom people, right? Take a shot and you'll feel better, right? And that's kind of the message that I was getting as a kid. And that's a lot of times the message that these kids in high school are seeing, right? The cool people drink, to feel better, you drink. If you want to do things, you drink. For me, it started progressing really early, but it really didn't crystallize till later in life. I got sober at 36 years old. But when I turned 21, there is not one 24-hour period that I went without drinking from 21 to 36. That includes Yontif, that includes Pesach, fast days, whatever. Like that became the normal for me. And I would go home, and even if it only started, it started innocently, right? Like at first when I started drinking, I was just being part of the crowd. I was just being social. I was just doing, conforming to all the other social norms. And, it would start at 4-beer DJ. I would only have 4 beers because 3 beers, I didn't feel what I wanted to feel, and 5 beers would make me sick. So I'd only drink 4. And then slowly but surely, as my tolerance built up, as we know what happens with substance use, right, I would drink more and more and more. So I'm gonna skip over some of the theatrical and some of the uglier parts because we don't need to know about those, and get back to the point of why I really like to share my story. So when I was really going through trouble towards the end of my substance use, right, people didn't really know, right? Obviously, I didn't look as handsome as I do today. I was about 40 pounds lighter. I went into detox at 112 pounds, right? And I was doing some crazy things but people didn't know. I was very much a closet drinker. Really, the person that knew the most about my drinking was my therapist, actually. It wasn't even my doctor at the time. And sometimes I showed up to her a little inebriated. She pretended she didn't know. That was where I felt comfortable really discussing my substance use. Now, another thing that I had that was really lucky for me at the time was I had a friend that was part of my core group of drinking buddies that actually got sober through recovery, through AA, through a program of recovery. And I got to watch the transformation of what this happened with this guy from drinking to sober. And it was fascinating because for me, the drink had taken over my life and I didn't see any way out. And yet here's this guy, right, who has his life together, who I'm seeing him develop this idea of present awareness, right? Who starts to, I saw his eyes clear up, and he starts to, like, I can talk to him and he's like in the conversation with me, right? Like he's not off somewhere and worried about drinking, and drinking's not running his life. And that was only what I knew about his use. Like that was, again, not what I didn't know, what he was doing at home. I mean, even my wife didn't know how much I was drinking. We become very tricky, right? I would have beer in the car, I would have beer in the garage, I would have, wherever I needed, I would have it, and one of the things I like to say also is, like, for us, I used to say candy is for getting the kids to shul and alcohol is for getting the adults to shul, right? But again, and not the best relationship with alcohol that I had, for sure. But anyways, I got to see my friend, and for 2 years I would walk home from shul with him and be like, I really need to talk to you, and he'd be like, anytime, brother, anytime, I'm there for you. And he was actually the first person I called from treatment, and I said, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. And he said, I know, I was just waiting for you to come first. And I think for me, this is the essence, this is the key, and this is why I try and do whatever I can to kind of put my story and my message out there, because when I said I needed help, when it came to a point where I finally realized I needed help, I didn't feel, first of all, I didn't know where to go to. I didn't know who to talk to. And the first thought, of when I told my wife that I needed help was shame, right? Here's this big thing that we're dealing with, and we're told it's bad. We're told it's a moral issue. We're told just stop. We're told, man up, or whatever we're told, right? Just stop doing it. And people don't understand the disease model of addiction and how this thing could literally take over our brain. And so one of the reasons why I've been passionate about getting out there and sharing my story wherever I can and talking in front of kids and really dedicating my life to helping people with this disease is because I don't want someone to have to go through what I went through. I had to wait 3 days after saying I needed help to actually get to detox. And those were the worst 3 days of my life because I had just told everyone. So just to go back real quick, I knew before Rosh Hashanah that I needed to go somewhere to get help. I knew I couldn't stop drinking on my own. That last month from then to Simchas Torah was like one long drunk. Like I barely remember it. I didn't do anything. I called into work every day, or I pretended I was at work. I didn't go to shul. I sent my wife and my son to shul. I sent them to, Suda Mafsekas before Yom Kippur at my parents' house without me, all so I could drink because like I knew I needed to go somewhere. I didn't want to go before Yantif, right? Because I felt that responsibility. So Matzah Yantif, Simchas Torah, I told my wife, I need help. And she started crying and I started crying, right? And and I made a big show of pouring out all the alcohol that I had in my house, except for a few bottles that I hid in the garage because, right, I couldn't stop, right? I had no control, even the little amount of control that I thought I had. And we're talking about what people are going to say about us. And she's like, this is such a terrible thing. It's such a terrible thing that you struggle with this. What are people going to say? That you need to go get help? And I said to her, well, what if they start saying the same things that they say about this other friend of mine? All this wonderful stuff that they're saying. Look at how strong he is. Look at how far he's come. Look at his eyes clearing up. Look at how present he is and how much he's changed for the better. And I said, that could be me also. It doesn't have to be a shameful thing. And again, this is why I reach out and I share my story. And, Baruch Hashem, for me, I've been in recovery for 6 years. I've dedicated my life to trying to help everyone else, and trying to get kind of right-sized and figure out what the real reason for me living is. And for me, what can I give back to the community instead of what I can take from it? And like, I feel like I'm just some regular guy. Like I'm not a role model. I feel for our community, we need people like my friend who people can point out to and say, look, that's what sober looks like, right? He's cool, he's with it, he still goes to shul, whatever. That's what sobriety can look like. And for me, I don't want to be that guy, right? Like I used to want that, right? That was part of the disease for me was this grandiosity of wanting to always be the man. Now I just want to work in the background. And for me, if no one else is going to step in and take that role, then I'm going to do it. And again, not because I want the accoutrements and I want the big thing. That was a different part of the reason why I was using, but because I think it's so important for us as clinicians, as leaders, to really step up for our community and really focus on the way that we can help change. And the way that we can help change is by modeling the behavior that we want. And it was something that my father told me all the time. If you want to impress upon your son what's important in Judaism, you have to do it first. And I think that the other message that I like to get out is, I mentioned that my father was Orthodox. He was learning. He was, he didn't start Daf Yomi yet, but now he's finished like 3 times. So I guess he's done it a few times already. He told me the second time through is easier. I'm like, I'm just worried about the first time. But, I didn't look up to him as much as I should have, because to me, he wasn't the cool person. And so the message is, you don't even know who it is that you're influencing. You don't know who else's kids. It's not just yours. You don't know who's looking at you and saying, if he can do it, I can do it, for the good and for the negative, right? Whether it's you saying, well, my rabbi drinks, so I can drink, or whether it's a kid saying, look at DJ, he's been sober now, I can be sober too. I think that's all that I have for you. I know I went a little bit over my limit. I want to pass over the, no pun intended, the baton to Dr. Beth, who will take over from here. Dr. Beth is awesome. I've known her for quite some time, like 3 months, and that's it. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank you, DJ. It's a real honor to follow you in this presentation. So I'm going to be talking very briefly about addiction as a whole. DJ's story gives particulars about himself, so we'll be talking in a more global, community-wide level here. And Rabbi David, if you'll start the PowerPoint, that would be great. As that's getting going, I'll say that you can advance the slide, please. Our goals quickly are to have an overview, again, briefly, about the dynamics that get addiction started and maintain addiction. We'll talk a little bit about diagnosing a substance use disorder, and then we'll talk about some risk and protective factors. Next slide, please. But before we get into those points, I wanted to talk a little bit about words, because of course, words matter. Words matter a lot. And you've just heard DJ refer to himself as an alcoholic and refer to himself in that way as an important recognition about himself. And any individual has the right to refer to themselves in whatever way they want and in ways that are important to them. And in certain contexts and certain cultures, and in particular, in this case, in 12-step culture and Alcoholics Anonymous and other anonymous programs, using terms like alcoholic or addict to refer to oneself is common. That's part of that culture. Those of us who are not within the recovery world or who are not referring to ourselves, we now encourage folks to use person-first language, as we do in so many areas now. Person-first language meaning that we aren't using a single word to describe an individual that people have lots of parts and components to themselves. So we literally use the word person first. And in the world of addiction, that would sound like a person with a substance use disorder, or a person in recovery, or perhaps a person in long-term recovery. If they've been in recovery for 3 years or 5 years, there's no certain definition of long-term recovery. So we're encouraging folks to use person-first language in the addiction world. Next, let's talk about the definition of addiction. I'm sorry, Rabbi David, would you please go back to that slide? Thank you. I'll cue you when it's time to move forward. So definitions of addictions change over time because our understanding of addiction changes over time, which is a great thing because we are becoming more sophisticated in understanding what addiction is, because addiction is complicated and hard to understand. A current definition of addiction might go something like this: that addiction is a chronic, progressive, relapsing, ultimately fatal, brain-based disorder. That's a lot of words, so let's take each one. Again, chronic meaning it lasts over time. Progressive meaning it gets worse over time. Relapsing meaning that relapse is a part of the disease of addiction. And it's important to understand that, because if somebody does relapse, it needn't be a surprise and it needn't be terrifying. It's to a degree to be expected, and accuse us that it's critically important to help that individual to get back on track in recovery. Relapse is to be taken very, very seriously. Certain use disorders, like opioid use disorder, for example, in relapse is very potentially fatal, because if somebody's been in recovery from an opioid use disorder and then relapses, their tolerance for the opiate has reduced dramatically and they can overdose very easily. So relapse is critically important, but it's also important to simply understand it as a part of the disease process, as it is for many, many medical diseases. Addiction is no different. Ultimately fatal as part of the definition. So if somebody doesn't get into recovery in one way or another, since addiction is progressive, we can unfortunately expect that addiction can be fatal if not treated. And lastly, that addiction is brain-based. And again, this helps to equate addiction with other medical diseases, which is important in reducing stigma, because every physical disease lives in the body somewhere, lives in some organ system or in a full body system like the lymphatic system or in the bloodstream. And addiction, similarly, lives in the brain. It's a brain-based disorder. Let's also talk about the definition of recovery. In 2006, the Betty Ford Institute brought together a group of addiction experts, and they came up with a long, pretty elegant definition of recovery. And one part of that, I'll read to you now. It goes, a voluntarily maintained lifestyle comprised of sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. So one thing to note there is that sobriety is only one of the three components that was identified in recovery, which is perhaps surprising for some folks, that you can actually be sober from the drug of choice but not be considered to be in recovery. How is that possible? Because recovery, as we understand the term, is more holistic than just being sober. It's a global well-being. It's healing all kinds of parts of one's life, not just being sober. So the next part of that definition, personal health, refers not only to healing the body of the addiction, but any other organ systems that were hurt by the addiction, because addiction can be hurtful and harmful to lots of different parts of the body. But personal health also refers to spiritual health, and it refers to mental health. So all kinds of health are important in recovery. And then lastly, the word citizenship, which I really like. It's a sort of an old-fashioned, quaint word that we don't use much anymore, but I think maybe we should be more and more these days. And citizenship refers to being part of a community, part of giving back to a community, a positive influence, being of service to a community. So that also is really important in terms of being in recovery. Okay, Rabbi David, if you would advance the slide, please. Thank you. So very briefly, what do we understand about addiction and its dynamics, how it gets started? Now here in particular, I'm not talking about any one individual. You just heard DJ mention that he does not recall having a particular trauma or a particular experience that seemed to kick off his alcohol use disorder. We do know, however, from research that a majority of people who end up in addiction treatment do have trauma histories. Might be a big T trauma, might be a little t trauma, or a series of traumas. I think is important here to understand is that folks are experiencing really overwhelming negative feelings, because that's one of the things that happens in trauma. The having to try to live with feelings that are overwhelming one's coping skills and coping strategies. It's very difficult to function in daily life while managing unmanageable negative feelings. It's very difficult. It's sort of impossible. So it's just natural that any one of us, if we had the experience of overwhelming negative feelings, would struggle to look for something that would help us manage or resolve or suppress or distract away from these overwhelming feelings. And unfortunately, alcohol and other drugs are really good at that. They're very consistent, because when we ingest alcohol or other drugs, a big release of dopamine happens in the brain, and that creates feelings of euphoria or deep peace or a whole lot of energy. And all of these feelings can distract us away from or help to suppress the overwhelming negative feelings that trauma can create. So it seems like using alcohol or other drugs can be the solution to the problem of trauma or otherwise created negative feelings. Rabbi David, if you'll run the video, we're going to watch a short video that helps to explain how what seems to be the solution actually then, though, becomes a problem itself.
It's important to understand that everyone in the world has addictions, or rather natural addictions, to things that are good, like food, water, and sleep. These natural addictions are important for our health and survival, and without them, we would not hunger or crave the things we need to survive. Now, we aren't exactly born with these natural addictions. Our body creates them. Let's look at an example. When you bite into an apple, your brain says, "Yum." Your brain recognizes that this apple is good for you. It has nutrition, vitamins, and gives your body the energy it needs to survive. Whenever the brain recognizes something that's good, it releases a chemical called dopamine. Dopamine causes you to experience pleasure. It's what makes you feel good, like when biting into an apple. The brain releases this dopamine in order to teach the body that this is healthy and good for your survival, and that it should remember to do it again. Now, there are other things we do that can release the pleasurable dopamine, like playing video games, exercising, or reading a good book. However, the amount of dopamine released during these activities is less than what's released when we eat food. The brain does this so it can recognize which is more important. So if you go 2 days without reading a book, or 2 days without eating food, your body is going to crave the food over the book. As such, your brain creates what's called a hierarchy of survival, which ranks how important each of these things is to your survival. Now, there are some things that will not cause the release of dopamine, like eating soap or punching yourself in the face. The brain knows that these things are not good and therefore does not release the pleasurable dopamine because your brain does not want you to do it again. Now, let's look at alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, and other drugs. These are all classified carcinogens, proven to cause cancer and other fatal diseases. Now, your brain should recognize that these things are harmful to your body. However, these substances have special chemical characteristics that fool the brain into releasing dopamine, oftentimes in much greater amounts than the body has ever experienced before. Because of this, the body is fooled into thinking that these things are good and important, sometimes even more important than food, water, or sleep, and consequently hijacks the #1 spot in your survival hierarchy. So now, if you go 2 days without eating or 2 days without drinking alcohol, your body will actually crave the alcohol over the food. This is an extreme case of addiction, where the person addicted believes that they will die if they don't get it. The severity of the addiction depends on where the alcohol or drug lies within your hierarchy of survival, and can increase even with casual use. Research shows that people under the age of 21 are at the highest risk of having their survival hierarchy hijacked. Why? Because their brains are still growing and developing and are hypersensitive to false shocks of dopamine caused by these harmful substances. By 21, the brain is more fully developed and mature, and the survival hierarchy becomes more permanent and less susceptible to getting hijacked. The flip side is that once you are 21, it becomes very difficult to remove these harmful substances from your survival hierarchy. Studies show that 9 out of 10 people who currently struggle with addiction started drinking, smoking, or using before the age of 21. Understanding addiction as a preventable disease can help save millions of lives. The decision to wait until 21 could mean the difference between a life enslaved by addiction or a life full of success and accomplishment. Want to learn more? Visit us at wait21.org.
Great, thank you. Rabbi David, you can bring the PowerPoint back up, please. So I think we see in that video that what had been the solution to the problem of overwhelming negative feelings, potentially caused by trauma, does in fact become a primary problem that requires treatment. And Rabbi David, if we can go to the next slide, please. One back. And back again. There we go. Thank you. I'm not sure if everyone is seeing a full screen slide. That would be ideal if we can go back to the PowerPoint as it was, but if not, then this is fine. I'll continue anyways. Okay, he's working on it. While he's working on it, let's talk a little bit about substance use diagnoses. There we go. Great, thank you. So SUD there at the top of the screen is substance use diagnosis. And this is substance use diagnosis is the current professional term for an addiction. These diagnoses are given with qualifiers. For example, somebody whose drug of choice is alcohol would be given a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder. And then there are others, for example, opioid use disorder or cannabis use disorder. There are 11 symptoms in this diagnosis. We're not going to go through all 11, but the number of those symptoms that an individual has will designate whether they're given a diagnosis of mild, moderate, or severe alcohol use disorder or cannabis use disorder, etc. One group of those 11 diagnoses that's important to talk about are the negative consequences. So an individual who is suffering negative consequences as a result of their use, yet continues to use alcohol or other drugs, most likely has a substance use disorder. And these are negative consequences that are important areas of an individual's life, like relationships or major life roles, like being a student or being an employee, having trouble with the law or losing parental privileges. These are all really important negative consequences. Basically, we're watching someone's life fall apart because of their substance use, yet they continue to use. I saw that there was a question in the chat during the video, and I'm going to mention non-substances here. So something that we've sometimes called behavioral addictions, sometimes called process addictions, now sometimes called non-substance related addictive disorders. These are things that we don't ingest, but things that we actually do that we seem to become addicted to. The only one of these behaviors that is actually an official diagnosis now is gambling disorder. So gambling can become an addiction. It is now an official disorder that somebody can be diagnosed with. But there are many, many others, and I'm sure we're aware of many of these. A whole bunch of them are screen related, social media, just general internet use, online pornography, other compulsive sexual behavior, shopping, spending, compulsive overeating. There are many, many behaviors that we engage in that seem to be involved in this same dopamine system in the brain, and that cause negative consequences in one's life, severe negative consequences ultimately, and are currently under investigation through research to see if they should become official diagnoses. And many of those can be treated, have up and running treatment programs, even if they don't have official diagnoses at this point in time. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So lastly, we're going to talk about harm or help. In other words, at risk or protective. All of the characteristics and dimensions that we're going to talk about can either be harmful vis-a-vis developing addiction or helpful or protective against developing addiction. The first group of these are individual characteristics. It does seem that some people are, well, we're all born, actually. We know from research, developmental research, that we're all born with personal characteristics, but all of these can also be learned or developed in time. Some personality characteristics seem to put folks at risk for addiction, like being rebellious or being impulsive. And other personality characteristics appear to be protective, like those kids who seem to just be born with a sort of easygoing attitude, those easy babies. I've heard of them. I've never actually experienced one, but I've heard that there are easy babies out there, or individuals who develop an ability to live with ease, as they say, to be kind of zen, to roll with the punches. An individual who has other psychiatric diagnoses is certainly at greater risk for developing a substance use disorder. Social skills appears to be very, very important. There are some folks either born with or develop an ability to talk to anybody and to have a strong, robust group of friends and get along with all kinds of people. And these characteristics are protective against addiction. The opposite then is true for being at risk for addiction, individuals who really, really struggle with relationships and find themselves isolated. Isolation is a great risk factor for the development of addiction. And then not surprisingly, personal success. So individuals who are successful as students and as employees and in whatever major life goals they set for themselves tend to be protected against addiction. Individuals who unfortunately experience the opposite or not succeeding in life are at risk for addiction. And these 4 characteristics, as I put in bullet points here on the PowerPoint, not surprisingly appear to interact with each other. Next slide, please, Rabbi David. Thank you. Harmful and helpful characteristics of the family. The family is very, very important in all kinds of ways. And we have lots of good research that supports all of these areas. I think probably most of us are aware that addiction has a genetic component. So if somebody looks back up their family tree and sees lots of addiction, then they know that they have a predisposition themselves as well. And in families where there is no addiction present, there's less chance, not no chance, but less chance of addiction developing in any one individual. The home environment is very important, either to be harmful or to be helpful. So homes in which there are lots of healthy relationships and good boundaries, where the parents have strong emotional intelligence and they model that in their marriage and within themselves and can teach that to their children, the individuals in that family will be somewhat protected against addiction. And of course, the opposite is true. Families where the home environment is unhealthy with poor boundaries and poor emotional intelligence, those individuals will be at greater risk. Parental supervision and involvement is very, very important in protecting children against addiction. And part of that is the clarity with which parents define and send messages about alcohol and other drug use. Some folks are of the belief, I would say probably our culture as a whole believes, especially with adolescents, that it's their peers' behaviors, their peers' attitudes that influence a young person's behavior. But actually, the research is very, very clear that it's the parents' behaviors and the parents' attitudes, the parents' messaging that impacts the adolescent most. So very important for us to understand that parents need to be giving over good, healthy boundaries and messaging around alcohol and other drug use for their kids, having rules around those messages, and then enforcing those rules. If all of those things are happening, the children are less likely to become addicted. And if there is poor messaging, either no messaging at all from the parents or very, very permissive messaging around the use of alcohol or other drugs, no rules or poor enforcement of rules, the kids will be more at risk. And next slide, please. Almost done. The community has a really important role to play here with addiction. And I think in the Jewish community in particular, we have some things to talk about and some things to think about as a community. One thing that we know for sure, and DJ mentioned this too, is simple access to alcohol or other drugs, or the ability to engage in other addictive type behaviors. To take it to kind of a ridiculous extreme, if alcohol didn't even exist or didn't exist in the United States, let's say, if there's no alcohol in the United States at all, then becoming addicted, having an alcohol use disorder, would be much less likely than it is with alcohol being present. And this was one of the concerns for those of us who work in the addiction field when recreational marijuana was legalized, because we knew that simple access to cannabis would increase, and having access increases the risk of addiction. Since we as a Jewish community have alcohol as part of our ritual weekly and throughout the year, we have to recognize that the fact that there is access to alcohol in our community for ritual purposes puts our whole community in a way at risk. So we need to be very thoughtful as a community about what kind of alcohol is available. When is it available? Is there good supervision of the alcohol? And that the risk is not just to youth, but to everybody, because adults are at risk of alcohol use disorder as well. DJ also mentioned role modeling. You'd think that he and I had gotten together to make sure that our presentations coordinated. So role modeling is very, very important as well. And at the community level, if alcohol is going to be present in ritual ways, then we need to, again, be thinking about what are our adults doing with regard to alcohol, but also cannabis use and other drug use that people within the community are seeing. What messages is the role modeling sending good role models with good boundaries around alcohol and other drug use is very helpful in terms of being protective against addiction. And lastly, engagement in the community. A lot of good research, again, that individuals who are very engaged in their community and have lots of different kinds of strong relationships at the community level have some protection against addiction. And here, again, as a Jewish community, we can be thinking about ways to engage our community members in our community in positive and pro-social ways, especially if we think about individuals who, for their individual characteristics or because of being part of distressed families, might be at greater risk for developing addiction. If we at the community level can reach out to these individuals and engage them in strong community relationships, we will be helping build their protective factors. Last slide, please, Rabbi David. This is who I am and how to find me at JCFS Chicago Addiction Services. We are happy to take calls from community members looking for information and referrals about addiction if they have concerns about themselves or a loved one or someone in the community, and do lots of community programs. So please reach out. We'd be more than happy to hear from you. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate the time. And now I'm going to turn the mic, so to speak, over to Yankie Greenberger.
Okay, thank you so much, Beth, or Dr. Beth Fishman. So it's always a pleasure to be here on this with the Orthodox Network. This is, I think, my third or fourth opportunity to present to this incredible network of professionals, and now a double bonus of being able to present alongside three of my top 5 favorite people in the world. My wife and kids being the other two. So it's great to be here. I'm going to focus, I know Dr. Fishman spoke about this a little bit. I'm going to speak a little bit more in depth about some of the non-substance abuse addictions, particularly sex addiction, because I think that's something that's really important to start talking about within our community. And I'm going to talk about some of the different variables and nuances that play a role with this particular behavior and or addiction and our community. So first, what is sex addiction? So sex addiction is basically repetition compulsion of sexual behavior. So a person is going to repeat compulsive sexual behaviors, whether it's under stress or duress, or sometimes, certainly as the addiction has developed and evolved, it becomes more of an urge that that the person will obsess about and will repeat it, kind of have that repetition compulsion where they act out a lot with it. I will say that, Dr. Fish was talking about gambling addiction being in the diagnosis codes now, but actually in the ICD-11, there is a diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. And I'm going to get into a particular line that's in the description of the diagnosis, because I think that's very important as we talk about sex addiction within the Jewish community. But I'm going to get to that in a moment. So we have to understand also that we live in 2022, and with the growth of internet technology, they've separated what's called classical sex addiction and contemporary sex addiction. The classical sex addiction is the guy or girl that has kind of doing having multiple affairs, hiring prostitutes, going to massage parlors, voyeurs, people. Unfortunately, we've had in this community over the last couple of weeks someone going around flashing himself and publicly masturbating in front of children, which is really traumatizing a lot of kids in the community. So that is something that is would be in the category of classical sex addiction. In contemporary sex addiction, it has a lot to do with pornography addiction, internet pornography addiction in particular, where the 3 A's take a hold, and that the 3 A's is accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. The combination of those 3 things, kind of like what Dr. Fishman was talking about with access, right? The amount of pornography that's being uploaded on a daily basis online would take years to watch. So every day, years worth of pornography is being uploaded on the internet. So I could wrap your head around that. And there's certainly that kind of leads to an easy progression of sexual addiction behavior. So I want to talk about classical sex addiction. I'll talk a little bit more about contemporary sex addiction, and then I want to get into that line that is in the ICD-11 description of the diagnosis. So the classical sex addicted person, or as Dr. Fishman, so the person with sex addiction behaviors. Typically, there, like was mentioned, there's a genetic component of addiction in the family, not necessarily sex addiction, but other addictions. If you look in the family tree, you will find addiction in the family. The family structure is typically rigid and authoritative. So with regard to our to the Orthodox community, I think this sometimes is represented through the observance of halacha, through the observance of things where it's not given over with passion and with sincerity, but something that's very authoritative, and you must do this and you have to do that, and it has to do with religious behaviors, religious observance, and other just natural things, and also very disengaged. And when I say disengaged family structures, I'm talking about emotional disengagement, where emotions is viewed as weak, where a lot of you gotta just tough it up and move on, and there's no time to like process difficult things that are happening in life as a person grows and develops. A lot of difficult things happen, but the ability to process that is taken away from the family system. So and again, that's part of the rigid thing. The other piece that's also very important is trauma. And when I talk about trauma, particularly with sex addiction, so we're talking about sexual, physical, and emotional trauma. And what I think you'll be surprised to hear, because I was surprised by this. And I wish there was a way to do a quick poll over here. I know there's a way, but I wasn't prepared, so I'm not gonna try to put on the spot. But if you had to guess which one of those 3 things were more relevant in someone who has developed a sex addiction, sexual, physical, or emotional, my hypothesis would be sexual. And the truth is that with sex addiction, the emotional trauma is something that stands out. And the statistic from ITAP, the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals, is that 97% of people who identify as a sex addict have disclosed emotional trauma in their life, versus 81% who identified sexual trauma and 72% that identified physical trauma. So certainly a failure to bond healthy attachment is significant when we talk about non-substance abuse disorders. So non-substance related disorders. So we talk about sex addiction, gambling the findings are very similar, actually. So when we talk about these things, the importance of emotional attachment, healthy emotional attachment, is excruciatingly important. And I think this is part of the generational trauma that we have suffered post-Holocaust is the ability to connect emotionally has really been hindered because of all the trauma. The ability certainly growing up with Holocaust survivors or children of Holocaust survivors, of being seen, be safe, secure, seen and soothed, is something that has really not been able to be given over so well. So that's something that we have to pay attention for in this generation of, in our generation of healthcare professionals and of parents, to be able to make sure that we're connecting emotionally and providing healthy bonding and healthy attachment. So when we talk about, so that's the classical sex addict. The contemporary sex addict who opened up a tab and went to a website, one thing led to another, opened up a website. We talked about the shots of dopamine before. Certainly that's being, when it comes to sexual behaviors or sexual imagery, that's something that is really, our dopamine gets fired away. And it's a lot easier for people who maybe come from a healthy family, a healthy attachment, a healthy bond family, who comes from a very engaged family system, not a very authoritative, but the real healthy person who stumbles upon pornography, it's a lot easier for them to get caught up in the world of internet pornography. In the efforts of understanding, the particulars of it, and we talk about like arousal template and what are some of the things that kind of draw them a little bit more, and that's kind of like where a lot of the exploration kind of comes into. But the difference between classical sex addict and a contemporary sex addict is significant in the fact that the classical sex addict, there's a lot of trauma there, typically. When the contemporary sex addict, there may not be any trauma, other than maybe early exposure to pornography, which is a pretty big trauma in and of itself, but even someone who is older and stumbles upon it. To go back to the definition of what a sex addict is, because I wanted to read you a line that is a differential diagnosis of sex addiction. And I think this is something, when we talk about the Orthodox community, we talk about people who house a tremendous amount of shame because of what they're doing in their behaviors, whether it be particularly when it comes to internet pornography. There's a line here that's very important, and the line is, in terms of differential diagnosis, is distress that is entirely related to moral judgments about sexual impulses, urges, or behavior is not sufficient to meet this requirement. So anyone whose distress is completely related to a moral place is not significant to be, is not sufficient to have the diagnosis of compulsive sexual behavior disorder. So what is that then? So someone who has distress that is entirely, or I would even say mostly, related to moral judgments, that's something that's being viewed at in the sex addiction community as moral incongruence. And moral incongruence is the sense of, I'm doing behaviors that I don't want to do because they go against my morals, they go against my values, they go against, in our community, they go against halacha. But it doesn't fall under the idea of repetition compulsion, right? If anything, the shame of this moral incongruence creates the repetition compulsion. So when we talk about that, we have to understand what is happening with this person. Is this person, looking at pornography and masturbating, what we would, say, what we would identify as it's not great, but you shouldn't be doing it, but it's not a repetition compulsion. It's not something that's causing distress because other people are getting hurt by it, because you're skipping work, or you're not, you're spending a lot of money on it, or you're not taking care of yourself, and that's really what's going on? Or is it just like, I have to do tshuva, and I have to go through the process of tshuva, and I'll, that's really a Rabbi Engel discussion, because that's not my thing, but it's the moral guilt and the moral shame that is really pushing this. And I think part of what we need to do as a community, this is throwing it out there, is we need to talk about, I don't want to get into the whole healthy, not healthy sexual behavior.
Good. How about you?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have to talk about, what's healthy, what's not healthy. I remember growing up, I had a rabbi talk about, if someone masturbates, so you're going to be put in, when you die in hell, you're going to be put in a vat of boiling sperm, and your soul is going to be like cook, I guess, bake. I don't know. I'm not really good in the kitchen, so I don't know if I'm cooking or baking in the vat of sperm, and the feeling is going to be, and this was somebody else told me, the feeling is going to be a sensation of elephants trampling on your face. Now, is it possible that in some esoteric, Kabbalistic sefer, there's something written there? I don't know. I don't do Kabbalah, and I don't do esoteric learning. But those just foment shame, and whether it's allowed or not allowed, the idea of masturbating and spilling your seed is, unfortunately, or fortunately, whatever it is, it's a common occurrence, and we have to find the right words to talk about this. Where, yeah, you shouldn't do it, but if you do, pick yourself up, clean yourself off, and go on. God still loves you, and all is good. And I think it's the impact of shame that really hurts a lot of people when it comes to this idea of moral incongruence, and it can exacerbate the repetition compulsion, which would then potentially lead someone to develop more of this sexual addiction behavior, because it's become this habitual type of process. I see there are a lot of questions here. I don't know if I want to should we get to it now, or should we let Rabbi Engel go? What should we do?
I suggest, Yankie, that we let Rabbi Engel speak, and then we'll have a chance to explore questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for letting me share. Rabbi Engel, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Yankie. Wonderful to be here with my fellow panelists, and thank you, of course, Rabbi Rosenberg, for inviting me to be part of this, and Tamara, Kushnir, Groman, for helping to organize, and all of those, Sam Spolter, everyone else who helped make this morning a possibility. I have so much to say, but I see we are way over time. I want to respond to each of the panelists and offer thoughts, but let me speak more generally this morning. I know we have a variegated group with us, some who are more familiar with the Orthodox community and some who maybe less so. I would preface my remarks by saying that's hardly a comprehensive presentation, but I just want to bring some of the spiritual dimension to some of what's been discussed here. And Michael Walzer, he's a professor at Princeton, has a book called Exodus and Revolution. And he maintains that every revolution in Western culture from the time of the Exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt has, without exception, so he claims, borrowed the imagery of the Exodus for the purpose of their national revolution. And I think that the idea of the Exodus as a Yetziat Mitzrayim as a model here is instructive for us to think about addiction of any form, behavioral, substance related, against the backdrop of a sense of enslavement to something and to a possibility of emergence from same. Of course, if someone has a physical symptom, it would not be a good idea to simply chalk it up to something spiritual without physical dimensions to it. In some communities, I'm aware that they take a very hard line separation between the realm of the physical and the realm of the spiritual. Someone has something biologically wrong with them, we'll address that feature. In Judaism, we certainly, when we pray for someone who needs healing, not only for the healing of their body, the refuat haguf, but the refuat hanefesh, their spirit should be healed. And I want to use this as an opportunity to speak a little bit about some of the themes that so many of us know, whether we're Jewish or we're not, we're members of the Orthodox community or not. We're so familiar with the concept of the enslavement in Egypt and the exodus from it, and the idea that this narrative is one that we are called upon as the Jewish community. We recite it every single year, and we try to internalize it. And from a spiritual vantage point, so much of the way in which the slide into addiction happens, the gateways, but then the way in which it has a progressive element to it, is invariably part of that same motif of a descent into slavery of a sort, one that challenges identity and purpose, one that has made a taskmaster, a pharaoh, a paro, as the Bible calls him, that is lording himself over the individual and telling the individual who they are and what they must do if they just want to stay alive, and not to think about anything else, not to think about any priorities in time or in space beyond their sense of feeling beholden to that taskmaster. The great Hasidic master, the Sfat Emet, writes that, as we have from our tradition, the idea that every individual should feel annually that they are leaving Egypt, have to feel that experience at a national level. He very much personalized it in line with the Hasidic thinkers. Ki b'chol dor, he writes, I'm reading in digital Hebrew and translating, Yesh Yetziat Mitzrayim Lefi Inyan Hador. Every generation has an element of exodus from Egypt according to the issue of that generation. All of this, whatever's happening in a given generation, is itself playing out that which transpired at the time of the Exodus. The more a person believes that they themselves have emerged, this aspect can be revealed from within themselves. They can feel the exodus transpiring of the generation in which they live. And here the key few words, every individual can emerge from their personal Mitzrayim, their personal, in English, the word Mitzrayim doesn't translate to English, to Egypt rather. In English, the word Mitzrayim is milashon meitzarim, something that is a straight, a narrow, constricted place, confinement, imprisonment. And the idea that if, for those who know the narrative, it's fairly basic to Western culture, whether you're Jewish or not, the Jewish people were not enslaved on day one. On day one, everything was going just fine. But with a soft voice, did the Pharaoh ask them to take on more and more tasks. And slowly but surely, there was a precipitous slide into the realm of slavery. If you think about the idea of what we do each year in preparation for Passover, Jewish homes around the world will go around ridding themselves of a ubiquitous substance that in and of itself may seem innocuous, but once a year, we suddenly make it the great boogeyman. The Torah itself tells us, rid ourselves of it. It's a process of cleansing and of searching, etc. And the sages in the Talmud draw a parallel between this substance, leaven, that's found in so many food products today, It's more prevalent than it was in previous generations, right? They actually consider it on a symbolic level to be as if it was an object of some type of personification of the evil inclination, or of that which is the force that draws us away from God, from spirituality. And so what we do is we nullify it. We rid ourselves of it physically, we nullify it. And there's a process that's going on. The sages teach that this is almost a symbolic way in which we go through the process so that we can apply the process to whatever the circumstance might be. Some of my co-panelists spoke about issues of access. So once a year, we rid our house, quite literally, we clean house. And we think about what it means that we might have internalized aspects of what's called chametz, of leaven. We nullify it, we speak about it, we bring language to it, and then we tell the story of our emergence from a position where we were, unfortunately, we admit, we say at the beginning, that we were slaves. We were slaves to a pharaoh, and we were taken out. We emerged. We became free. The Talmud teaches that there's a line from the book of Psalms, you shall not have a strange God within you, and don't bow to a foreign force. The Talmud says, Ezehu el zar, sheyesh b'gufo shel adam. What actually is the foreign God that's within a person? That's the evil inclination that grows within them, that can take hold. It's a process of estrangement that starts to become the regnant, if you will. And when we think about it this way, we can actually start to understand that a lot of the recovery literature is, in my view, very much in line with basic themes of Judaism, basic themes, particularly of the story of an Exodus. We know that there is a lot of discussion about the distinction between religion and spirituality, and it's an important distinction. This past week in synagogues around the world, that's what the Jewish people read about. They were asked to be a holy people. So one of the commentators, a medieval commentator, points out, his name is called the Ramban, that actually a person could actually follow all the laws and yet be a person who is unfortunately beholden to, whether it's, he uses the examples of alcohol or sexual expression that is unhealthy, and yet somehow is even skirting within the lines of Judaism. That person, unfortunately, is very far away from the goal of being a person who exudes holiness. For those who are familiar with the world of recovery, you know that the 12 steps that are so famous and well known, if you have any familiarity with Judaism, you know that right in those 12 steps, you're looking at the process that within the Jewish context, we call tshuva, of return, of an individual coming back to themselves, that it does begin with a sense that there can only be one God, and that God can either be God, or it could be some kind of other substance or behavior that begins to rule the individual and to take over. When Carl Jung wrote his letter of thanks back to Bill Wilson for his thanks letter in 1961, right? He spoke about this. He wrote about this exact idea, and he confessed he couldn't really formulate it in language, but he said the patient's craving for alcohol was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our whole being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language as the union with God. How could one formulate such an insight in a language that is not misunderstood in our days? That was in 1961. Imagine today. But to consider what that means, that the process of recovery as we have it now, may indeed be part of a holistic approach that includes biological, maybe pharmacological, other kinds of talk therapy, et cetera. But the world of recovery itself, the recovery community, is actually engaged in a process that is deeply spiritual. And he uses the expression, in fact, spiritus contra spiritum. Have you ever noticed that alcohol's other word, they call it alcohol and spirits? It's a play on words, the word spirits, because the ancients used them in order to get to an ecstatic state to serve their idolatry generally. And it's telling that spirituality to countermand the force of the spirits, if you will, the spirits which have an idolatrous component to them as well. And that an individual who is an addict is so often seeking some kind of wholeness that they don't have, and that they search for. That's why the footnote to the letter by Carl Jung quotes in the book of Psalms from chapter 42. Like a hind crying for water, my soul cries out for you, God. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God, not the dead God, who is the God of the authoritarian. That's that one of our panelists was describing, who's wagging a finger and telling people they're going to go to hell, and doing things that are talking about a rigid approach that has nothing to do with the realities of the human condition, but au contraire, being able to bring a living God into the life of people. The 12-step programs that exist, I know I'm most familiar with the one related to alcoholism, but I know that now all the other iterations, whether it's in terms of gambling, in terms of other kinds of behavioral addictions, I think they're in line with that idea. Granted, they don't say the word God at the beginning; they say higher power, etc. But anyone who's Jewish should realize that if they're engaged in the work of recovery, it is, number one, an incredibly heroic journey and a hard journey. But number two, it is completely, in my view, in line with the processes that our sages of the Torah have taught us over the generations. There's an excellent book, just refer you to two excellent books if you want to do further reading on this from the perspective of Orthodox Judaism. One is called God of Our Understanding by Rabbi Shastaub. Oh, I see DJ's got his thumbs up. An excellent, excellent book. Excellent. I'm out of superlatives, so I'm just repeating the word excellent ad nauseum. The other one is a more recent book called Stepping Out of the Abyss, a Jewish Guide to the 12 Steps, which includes a chapter written by Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Torsky of sacred blessed memory. Yankie's giving me the thumbs up. These are excellent books, and I highly recommend them. And if you have clients who are struggling with addiction, whether it's substance addiction, behavioral addiction, these are two excellent books about, I would say, the synthesis between the process of recovery and the reality of what Jewish teachings have been saying for centuries and millennia, in fact, about these issues. I was also asked to talk about the realities in our community, and it's a very painful subject. I applaud DJ's courage in speaking about this issue and dedicating himself professionally toward helping others whose plight is this is presently to be stuck in the Mitzrayim, in the personal Egypt of the slavery of an addiction. It's a great thing to have gotten out of it. I'm speaking strictly from a religious perspective. I'm not speaking from a clinical perspective, but from a religious perspective, we've always had a very ambivalent relationship with substances, particularly alcohol. According to one of the opinions in the Talmud and Tractate Brachot, the reality of the eating from the forbidden fruit, the fruit was not, as it is in Western culture, an apple, but there are other contenders, none of which is an apple in the Talmud. One of them is they drank wine. That Eve squeezes grapes in a cup, it ferments immediately, and Adam drinks it. That Noach, of course, gets drunk. We have an expression in Judaism, shichruto shel Lot, the drunkenness of Lot. The reality that we have a very ambivalent relationship is actually ongoing. And the question is, and it is an open question, about whether the use of wine, which was for most of human history, the common beverage, wine, ale, and sometimes water which couldn't be purified and oftentimes had toxins in it, wine that had fermented and therefore was certainly the drink of choice, oftentimes not just for social reasons, but that was what they had. There weren't fruit juices in a refrigeration. Milk could be milk from a cow and consumed immediately. Wine, ale, these are all intoxicating beverages. So often in antiquity, they were bound up with religious observances. In pagan cultures, drunkenness. In Judaism, in the book of Leviticus, very overtly opposed to any kind of drunkenness in the service of God. None, zero. Not as an aid to service, nothing. And yet, tellingly, the Talmud talks about the rabbis telling us that when we recite Kiddush, that we should, Kiddush is one of the main prayers that we recite at the beginning of holy days, we raise a goblet of wine. Today, with the advent of grape juice, There were many great sages who did not use wine ever. They used grape juice. The Chazon Ish and the Brisker Rav used grape juice. Rav Soloveitchik used grape juice. If he felt, he said, for people who don't like wine, just use grape juice, even on Passover and Pesach with 4 cups. And I wonder, I say here again, I speak not from a clinical perspective, and I'm not speaking for someone who has a proclivity towards whether genetic predisposition or behavioral issues with alcohol, but for someone who does not have those issues, if the whole idea of raising up a goblet of wine is for the purpose of the sanctification of the day, not 5 goblets, 1 goblet, and taking a sip, is about saying we have this in control. Now, I'm not talking about someone who's in recovery. For them, it's a poison, lo aleinu, a deadly poison. But the idea that this is something that has brought what the Talmud calls yilala la'olam, wailing to the world, and yet we're saying, you know what, we're going to raise it up. It's a low thing. We're going to raise it up. We're going to recite a blessing over it and try to raise up even that which is low. When we speak about cannabis, et cetera, recreational marijuana as an example, that's not a development that, from a rabbinic perspective, I could view as something positive. But I will say in the same breath that there were and are circumstances where, for medicinal purposes, people who were in excruciating pain had their pain relieved by marijuana. That's not what we're talking about in terms of addictions, and certainly not recreational. But to recognize that there is a certain tension that goes on here in terms of some of these substances. We talk about sexual addictions and the like. I'll content you just with the story that they say in the name of one of the great Hasidic rabbis whose Hasidim live in Williamsburg, New York, that he pointed out, apparently, allegedly, already 2 decades ago, that a Hasid, meaning someone who has a very high degree of religious observance, who lives in Williamsburg, has to take the train into Manhattan to work, will have more temptations facing them in one train ride than the grandparents had in Europe, in the little town, in an entire lifetime, And that's something that our community has not yet wrestled with enough. We did make certain inroads and do certain things. A lot more to say on this subject too, but I don't want to monopolize too much more of the time here. Just to say that if you have no exposure to Jewish touchstones, if you will, to try to understand how to speak to someone in the Orthodox community about these issues, you can, number one, refer them to the reality that the Jewish tradition is very much in line with the recovery community. I mentioned those books, and I'll put them in the chat if they haven't already been put into the chat while I was speaking just now. But also the idea that Shais Taub mentions this of terminal uniqueness. Individuals who claim my case is so different. You just don't understand. My case is so different. I get that in my office sometimes. I've unfortunately had to deal with cases. Usually the rabbi is not invited in unless there's some incredible catastrophe that either transpired or is looming for a family, and they don't know where else to turn. They'll come to the rabbi to try to, quote unquote, fix it, which is, of course, itself magical thinking. But the notion of terminal uniqueness is not just one for someone who's engaged in addictive behaviors, to think that they're somehow exceptional, but it's actually sometimes a terminal uniqueness that the Orthodox community sadly indulges for itself. They say other people get drunk. Our culture is not about drunkenness. We're drinking for holiness. We're drinking for mitzvah, for good things. And I can tell you that that's a sham. That's simply not true. Addiction exists in our community, behavioral addictions, certainly substance addictions. It remains a very complex reality for us in our community, that we're thankful that we have various organizations like JCFS that can help us in terms of helping individuals and sometimes families through extremely challenging and trying circumstances. Last word, if you're a Jew or if you're not a Jew, either way, but you're a person that is struggling with addiction, there's a road back. There's a way out of your personal Mitzrayim, their personal Egypt. There is redemption that can come. And I would highly recommend those 12 steps which touch on exactly the points of Jewish tradition's way of understanding enslavement and then the emergence from servitude to a place of redemption and to a place of light. So I'll turn it right back to you, Rabbi Rosenberg, I guess, or whoever's moderating the questions. And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much to our speakers, to DJ Shabat, Dr. Beth Fishman, Yankie Greenberger, Rabbi Engel for your rich presentations. We do have the opportunity to have some question and answer at this point. And some questions were shared in advance. I've seen some questions in the chat. I know that questions were referred to by our speakers, which may have been sent to them directly. So I'm going to spotlight all of our speakers and then share some questions, and we're going to have as much discussion as our time allows. Just give me a second to add spotlights for our presenters. I need to find Rabbi Engel. Rabbi Engel, just give me a moment to find your square here so I can. I'm not seeing Rabbi Engel here just yet. So
here I am. Can you see me now? Did it highlight me? There we are.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much. Okay. So some questions that came up in advance and that I saw in the chat. There's a lot of interest in the ways that that education can help, or the absence of education in schools might impact the development of young people in terms of their interaction with pornography or with various substances. So thoughts about the role of and the timing of education about sex and sexuality, and about drugs in Orthodox institutions and schools. Any thoughts that the presenters can share about that? And when it's appropriate, and ways it would be helpful for different types of Orthodox schools to address questions of sex education and drug education.
I'll jump in, and I got a couple of those questions that were sent to me directly. So I think it's tricky. I think really it's the messaging around these topics whenever these topics come up. I think we have to acknowledge. It's like I think one of the things that we need to do is for our educators. And really the leaderships of the schools to help the educators find the right words and the right messaging as it relates to at least certain sexual behaviors, sexual development issues. I know there's a lot of headway being done, but I think we just need to do a little bit more of it. And I think the thing that makes things worse is when you take a taboo topic and make it more taboo. And I think we have to work as a community with leadership to find the right words so we can help our educators have the words to use when it comes to these issues coming up, topics coming up. We and again, this is more Rabbi Engel saying I don't want, but throughout the Torah, I'm learning a lot of different things when it comes to there are a lot of sexual topics that come up, whether it's Jacob with the wife of Potiphar, what happens over there, and what was so unique about that whole
Joseph, yeah.
Oh, Joseph, sorry, my bad. Joseph. I was thinking about Yaakov because of different times. All right, so Joseph, right, with Potiphar. The wife of Potiphar, and what happened over there, and there's an opportunity to talk about things in a non-shaming way. So I think that we have to find the right words, the right messaging around this.
So a few things, and just to dovetail on what Yankie just mentioned, first of all, I believe, I actually don't know, but I believe that many, if not all, the Orthodox schools do have some kind of family life education that they do, talking about sexuality and the like. Part of the issue within the Orthodox community, of course, is that we do place a premium on issues of privacy and dignity. It goes in Hebrew by the moniker tzniut, which is often just translated simply as the term modesty, and then is reduced to clothing and attire. And that's kind of like saying you want to reduce the experience of I don't know, of going on you know, I don't know what, going on vacation to what car did you rent? I don't know. That's the vehicle how you get there. It's you're missing the whole point of what's going on. Tzniut is a whole mindset of privacy and dignity. So allowing for that factor, which is an important factor, not the reducible part to, you know, length of skirts and necklines, etc., but speaking much more broadly about it, the experiential components to sexuality. Many of the stories in the Bible are actually very much related to sexuality, starting with Adam and Eve and the snake in the garden. The snake, according to one opinion in the sages, is actually propositioning Eve that the two of them will run off and get rid of Adam, which seems rather strange, but it's right at the beginning of the story, and so on and so forth. They could trace through many of the stories in the Bible before you even get to Joseph and the wife of Potiphar in terms of temptation. There are a lot of stories dealing with sexuality. The question is how to present it in an age-appropriate way for kids. When parents come talk to me about it, I tell them, look, you have the following choice. You can talk to them about these issues, or the street will tell them. What do you want to do? Because one of the issues that we are confronting now, by now I mean really the last, let's say, 20-something years, but especially since 2012, when social media took off and handheld devices became much more prevalent, talking about access, etc. We can't wall off the world. It's just not a healthy approach. So the idea that we're, instead of building resiliency, we'll just keep kids' innocence as long as we can and then throw them to the dogs, that's just not going to work. I know that some of the schools definitely have programs in them. There's actually an excellent book by a woman. Her name is, I think, DeRoven, I think is her last name. It's actually called like Talking to Your Kids About Sexuality in the Orthodox Community. I've recommended different parents. Also an excellent book. It walks you through talking to kids in an age-appropriate way about body image, self-image, but also sexuality. And like, oh, that's the book. Yes. Is that her? Did I get the name right?
We'll share this and other sources.
Yeah, fine. But that's, you know.
This is talking about intimacy and sexuality. I don't know your favorite people.
Yeah, that's the book. Thank you. Share the book. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Rabbi Linzer just pointed out Yocheved Debo.
Debo. I'm sorry, Debo. Sorry.
Right, Rabbi Linzer.
Oh, Rabbi Linzer knows who it is. Yeah, I think she spoke at the school actually. Yeah, this is a crucial element of our who we are. If I could just talk about one of the questions that was sent to me directly by someone who pointed out that the challenge of the model of leaving Egypt and calling chametz, the leaven, relating it to, you know, the substance or what have you, and removing it once a year, I join with the person who sent it to me that certain addictions, whether it's food, technology, sexual addictions, they're not things you can hold at bay completely, but rather it's about building a healthier relationship with them. So in other words, you can say we're going to rid our house of alcohol, we'll rid our house of other drugs that are potentially lethal and dangerous, but you can't say we'll rid our house of food because there's someone who has a problem with their relationship with food. We have to rebuild a healthier relationship. Full disclosure, I should have mentioned this earlier. In 2018, before Pesach, before Passover, my public lecture was on the subject of the power of chametz and the power of bittul. And I talked about technology as something that we could not shut off and do not want to shut off on one level. It's, even if we wanted to, it's not happening. Not that it's an ideal, but by the same token, the pitfalls of said technologies, just on the most basic level in terms of the time factor that it usurps for so many of us, and the addictive component before we get to the sexual aspects and the pornographic dimension. Just the addiction to technology itself requires a certain recalibration of relationship. In terms of from a behavioral perspective, I try to speak about it from a spiritual vantage point, using that as a model of recalibrating relationship with regard to chametz. Okay, so.
Thank you. So another series of questions were raised about the synagogue and possible challenges for people who are in recovery. So a number of institutions that exist in some places. There have been references, DJ, in your presentation, you referred to, I think, maybe you referred to Kiddush Club or Kiddush in general, drinking at Shalom Zachar, welcoming a new baby boy before the bris, before the circumcision on Friday night, weddings, and questions about gummies at Shabbos tables and how different that might be from drinking at a Shabbat meal. So, Rabbi Engel, certainly this is something that I'm sure you give thought to, but maybe for all of our speakers to address these challenges.
So if I could jump in for a minute here. So I think one of the real important aspects here is again, the behavior that we as parents and mentors are modeling for our children. And I think it's very important that the way that we share them, the way that we share our relationship with whatever the substance is, showing it in a way that, yeah, it could be real ritualistic, but then when we have this competing message of a Shalom Zachar and everyone's getting drunk, right? It's not the same message as we're doing this for, to consecrate a holy meal. And I think like that kind of throws into the face almost, when we're trying to send this message of take this substance seriously and then we don't, we're modeling a poor behavior. And I think that it's also important to recognize that a lot of what we are doing now is we're not going to necessarily see the change in our lifetime. Like the change that we're aiming for here is for our kids to change with their kids. And I think that's very important because we don't live in the shtetl anymore. And there's a lot of influences that we have growing up that we're not, that first of all, weren't as identified back then, right? Like ADHD and stuff like that. As we become smarter and more educated, so to speak, scientifically, and the world gets bigger, we have grown as a people, which is why we're providing these educations that my generation didn't have. And I think it's important to understand that what we're trying to do is raise our kids in a way so that when they're the parents, they're modeling the correct behavior too. Because for a lot of what we're doing, a lot of what we're discussing here, it's too ingrained in adult folks for them to really accept that change, and I take myself as responsible too, right? Like when I was going through my trouble and I would hear Reb Zev Cohen talk about alcohol and how bad it was, Reb Zev Cohen, right? What does he know, But I also remember that when I was younger in Skokie Yeshiva, that he used to get drunk on Purim and that now he doesn't, right? So like there's as we grow as a people, as we grow it as educators and we understand better what our messages and how our behaviors are being modeled for everyone else, that's where we can make this change. So like at a Shalom Zachar, at a Purim, right? You said the Chazon Ish didn't even drink. So why did the Chazon Ish not like getting mitzvos? Like why wouldn't he get drunk on Purim? Well, he doesn't like mitzvos? He doesn't like, doing good deeds? Of course not, right? It's because there's this fallacy that we tell ourselves that it's this big mitzvah to get drunk. And I use my brother-in-law, Yossi, as like the perfect example of this. My brother-in-law hates drinking. He hates it. He hates the taste of alcohol. Yet every Purim he gets obscenely drunk. And what's cool about him is when he gets drunk, he talks about Torah, which is like its own kind of cool thing, like how much he loves Torah. But it's this danger that he's putting himself in, that he's putting not only him, but the kids that are looking up to him, because he thinks that it's this big mitzvah to do. And again, the Chazon Ish didn't hate mitzvos, right? Rashi was a vintner. You think he hated mitzvos? Like, you think he got drunk on Purim? Like, it's a disconnect. And so the answer to the question is, the way we're modeling our relationship with substances, whatever they are, whether they're alcohol, whether they're gummies, whether they're, sexual situations, and the way that we treat these in our home and in the broader community is the way that we're really going to change what we think about with our kids. So yes, it's very important for us to have ritualistic aspect of the substances that we're using, but it's also important to differentiate that from misuse because we think it's a party time now. Sorry, that was kind of my rant. I'll go off.
Thank you very much, DJ. Another question that was asked, and I know that our time is now 10:47, is a question about devices, actually. So one participant wanted to know about ways, are there filters that might help in preventing people from engaging in addictive imagery on their phones, tablets, and computers? There's an organization called TAG that's involved with this. If so, should rabbis and other community leaders be pushing or encouraging community members to get filters on the devices, regardless of whether or not they are personally struggling with this challenge? Any thoughts about, it's a communal effort to help folks maybe more safely interact with their technology? Any thoughts about that?
From my perspective, again, I'll jump in there because I haven't heard myself talk enough yet, is I'm like so happy that this stuff wasn't around when I was a kid, because it was so much more difficult for me to get my hands on this material. And so I think part of what I mean by normalizing this behavior is kind of understanding where it is that it's coming from and then being able to have a healthy communication about it, right? Kids, they're curious, they want to know these things, as boys, as we're growing and our body's changing, right? We want to have these things, and no matter what, there's going to be access to it. I remember the place where I found a porn on the street somewhere, and every time I pass that place to this day, I look and see if there's a porn there, a magazine, just because that's what was available. And I think it's very important for us to really talk with them about having healthy relational issues, about healthy sexual desires and appetites, and frame it in a way that it normalizes the behavior while at the same time takes out the shame of feeling that way. And I think that's very important across all areas.
Thank you. In moments that we still have, Dr. Beth and Yankie and DJ and Shabat, Rabbi Engel, would you like to share a parting thought before we go on to wrap up our program? Maybe Dr. Beth, if you'd like to speak first.
Sure, a couple of thoughts. One, going back to the first question that was asked about the timing of alcohol and other drug prevention education. I think many people in the prevention education world would say that young people are beginning to experiment with or use alcohol and other drugs at ages that would surprise folks, and that it's best to begin prevention education before anybody establishes their pattern of use. So here we're talking about late elementary school age. If you want to catch folks before they start to use, then we're looking at 4th and 5th grade, but certainly by 6th grade, and then continuing with prevention education in developmentally appropriate ways throughout the rest of schooling. Very, very important. And then just a statement about many of the rest of the questions. We tend to have a relationship with alcohol in the Jewish community that we have inherited over many, many, many generations, over the millennia. And these traditions with regard to ritual and recreational alcohol use were established when we didn't know very much about addiction. In fact, probably knew very little at all about it, because who had brain imaging all those many millennia or decades ago? And so this is a community-wide effort at many multiple levels and all kinds of ways, and everybody has a role to play in, I guess, stepping off of autopilot, maybe is how I would put it, taking the opportunity in all of our families and organizations in the shuls to stop and say, let's have a discussion and let's make conscious, thoughtful choices about alcohol. And as I said before, about what kind of alcohol, when, where, how, what are the boundaries around it, where's the supervision of it? Because we're all so busy. It's so difficult to do a community-wide stop and hold and discuss and make new and different choices based on what we know now and about the current challenges that we have, which are different than challenges in the past. So I just encourage all parts of our community to take a pause, if at all possible, and rethink all of the decisions that are made so that we're moving forward in a thoughtful and mindful way. Thank you.
I guess I'll go next because I see that DJ and Rabbi Engels are still muted, so I'll jump in. Parting words. I think talk a lot about alcohol, and I agree so much with my fellow panelists about alcohol misuse in the community. In times that I've spoken about this, I've shared and I've looked for this study a few times. So I don't know if it was redacted, or I was hallucinating when I saw it. But there was this study about how healthy modeling of alcohol consumption, drinking, having a glass of wine, with the meal, or having just, I know, which is a custom that some people do, having a shot of alcohol in between the fish and the meat. Some level of healthy modeling of drinking actually helps people learn how, the positive affect, the positive relationship with alcohol. So I don't want to lose that, because I think that alcohol does have a role in Judaism, and like what DJ was saying, that the Chazon Ish and some other people didn't drink, and I think that there's some discussion about that. So I think that we just have to look for ways to consistently model healthy drinking if there's going to be that out there. With regard to technology, someone asked about the tag thing. So they know best about filters, and certainly it's a great way to have a filter there as a form of prevention. When people are already in the throes of their internet pornography addiction, you're not going to stop them with whatever filter they have. I've had people in my office whose phone is completely shut down, pull out their phone and show me within 20 seconds how they access internet on their phone, which was completely blocked, locked, and with a padlock and straitjacket and all that phone. Whatever you can imagine the phone having, the phone was that phone had, and within 20 seconds they were on a porn site, which I told them they didn't. I believe them. They don't have to show me, right? So I think we just have to be more. We have to be more open about the discussion. And one of the questions I got that was, is this a discussion to have as a large group or a more private group? I think every parent needs to have the words to talk to their kids. At the end of the day, the responsibility is with the parents. The school's doing their best. It's hard to talk about this topic in a in a public forum because sensitivity levels are very different. But I definitely think that parents, and we should encourage parents to find the right words, and everyone on their level, whether you want to, some parents don't have the ability to say the word penis, right? And they need to say the word erva, right? Because they can't talk about different words the same way. They can say zer levatola versus masturbation, so every parent knows what their capacity is to talk about different things. So I think as clinicians and as people with some of the incredible organizations that represent this Orthodox network, we have to help families find the right words to talk about this with their kids, and then the schools and the rabbis and the shuls will support this. But I think at the end of the day, it's the parents' responsibility to give off that healthy messaging, and let the kids come to them when they have questions. Thanks for letting me share, and thanks for letting me be a part of this.
If I can go real quick, Rabbi Engel, I just wanted to share specifically about AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It is a spiritual program. One of the sayings we have is we are not cured of alcoholism. What we really have is a daily reprieve contingent on the maintenance of our spiritual condition. And it very, very clearly talks about spiritual instead of religious. The whole idea of God, it's not a Christian religion. It's not, AA has nothing to do with Christianity. It works well. It talks about spiritual principles like honesty, integrity, helping others, these types of things that are principles that work with any type of religion, because at its core, every religion's number one rule is don't be a jerk, right? So that's kind of, AA in a nutshell. I think it's very important also for us to understand that it's very stigmatized and it's very looked down upon. It's very scary. Reach out to someone in the community. If you or someone you know that is in AA that would like to just step up and be an advocate, you can call me. I will help somebody. I don't have to necessarily take them to a church to be in an AA meeting. JCFS and Jack's, I get the email every month about all the meetings and communities that are out in the shoals and whatever. So again, and lastly, you'd be surprised at the amount of Jewish wisdom that I use when I teach recovery groups about recovery. And I'm not like a rabbi, but I grew up in a lot of Mishnah and a lot of Gemara and a lot of things, a lot of stuff that I stole from Rabbi Chase Taub that helped me to explain exactly what it means by being a spiritual person instead of religious, and how to connect with that higher power in our lifetime. Pesach is our, freedom from bondage. Thank you so much for letting me share, everybody. It's been great to be on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much for our speakers. And I know we've got more to say, and we'll be sharing resources afterwards. I'm glad we mentioned about AA. And I know there's more that we would like to say. So a hand to all of our speakers, and I'm going to turn over right now to my colleague Tamara to wrap up our program.
Thank you so much to each of our presenters, DJ Shabat, Dr. Beth Fishman, Yankie Greenberger, and Rabbi Tzvi Engel. We are so fortunate to have each of you in our community. Thank you again to each of our sponsoring agencies for your support. Before you leave, please fill out the survey that was just shared in the chat. So I'm actually going to keep you all here for another minute because I have the CEU code. And in that 1 minute, you're going to click on the link to start filling out the evaluation form. The CEU code word is May 10th. With the word 10th spelled out in letters, so May 10th. Also, if you enjoyed this program and you have ideas for other programs, we'd love to hear about it in that evaluation. Thank you all for spending your morning with us.